This is The Metaphysics of War, Battle, Victory, and Death in the World of Tradition by Julius Evola. Chapter 7, Race and War. Originally published on the 20th of October, 1939 as La Raza e la Guerra in La Difesa della Raza. One of the most serious obstacles to a purely biological formation of the doctrine of race is the fact that crossbreeding and contamination of the blood are not the only causes of the decline and decay of races. Races may equally degenerate and come to their end because of a process, so to speak, of inner extinction, without the participation of external factors. In purely biological terms, this may correspond to those enigmatic inner variations, in brackets here, idiovariations, which science has been forced to recognize are just as powerful as variations due to crossbreeding in bringing about mutations. This will never be completely understood if the biological conception of race is not integrated with that racism of the second and of the third degree, quote unquote, of which we have repeatedly spoken here. It is only if race is considered as existing not only in the body, but also in the soul and in the spirit, as a deep metabiological force which conditions both the physical and the psychical structures in the organic totality of the human entity. It is only if this eminently traditional point of view is assumed that the mastery and mystery of the decline of races can be fathomed in all its aspects. One can then realize that, in a way analogous to the individual abdication and inner breakdown of the individual, where the loss of all moral tension and the attitude of passive abandonment can gradually find expression in a true physical collapse, or can paralyze natural organic resources far more efficiently than any threat to the body. So developments of the same nature can occur on the plane of those greater entities which are human races, on the greater scale in space and in time of their aggregate lifespans, and what we have just pointed out about organic resources neutralized when the inner moral and spiritual tension of an individual is lacking, can even allow us to consider less simplistically and less materially the matter of racial alterations due to mixing, miscegenation, and contamination as well. This is quite similar to what happens in infections. It is known, in fact, that bacteria and microbes are not always the sole effective and unilateral causes of illness. For a disease to be acquired by contagion, a certain more or less strong predisposition is necessary. The state of integrity or tonicity, I think they mean tenacity, okay, I see. The state of integrity or tonicity of the orgasm. The state of integrity or tonicity of the organism, in turn, conditions this predisposition, and this is greatly affected by the spiritual factor, the presence of the whole being to himself, and his state of inner intrepidity or anguish. In accordance with this analogy, we may believe that, for crossbreeding to have a really fatally, inexorably degenerative outcome for a race, it is necessary, without exception, that this race already be damaged inwardly to a certain extent, and that the tension of its original will be lax as a result. When a race has been reduced to a mere ensemble of atavistic automatisms, which have become the sole surviving vestiges of what it once was, then a collision, a lesion, a simple action from outside is enough to make it fall, to disfigure it and to denature it. In such a case, it does not behave like an elastic body, ready to react and to react and to resume its original shape after the collision, provided, of course, that is, that the latter does not exceed certain limits and does not produce permanent actual damage, but rather it behaves like a rigid, inelastic body which passively endures the imprint of external action. On the basis of these considerations, two practical tasks of racism can be distinguished. The first task could be said to be one of passive defense. This means sheltering the race from all external actions, crossings, unsuitable forms of life and culture, etc., which could present the danger to it of a crisis, a mutation, or a denaturation. The second task, in contrast, is active resistance, and consists in reducing to a minimum the predisposition of the race to degeneration. That is to say, the ground on which it can be exposed passively to external action. This means essentially to exalt its inner race, to see to it that its intimate tension is never lacking, that as a counterpart of its physical integrity, within it there is something like an uncontrollable and irreducible fire, always yearning for new material to feed its blaze, in the form of new obstacles which defy it and force it to reassert itself. This second task is obviously more arduous than the first, because it can demand solutions which vary from individual to individual, and because external, general, and material measures are of little use for it. It is a matter of overcoming the inertia of spirit, that force of gravity which is in force in human interiority no less than in the outer physical world, and here finds expression precisely in the inclination to abandonment, to take it easy, to always follow the path of least resistance. But, unfortunately, for the individual as well as for the race, to overcome this danger, it is necessary to have a support, for the ability to act directly, to always remain at the crest of the wave, to maintain an inner initiative which is always renewed, without the need for renewed stimuli, can only occur as a result of an exceptional endowment, and cannot reasonably be demanded as a matter of course. As we have said, for tension which has become latent to reawaken before it is too late and the processes of automatization of race follow, an obstacle, a test, almost a challenge is necessary. It is then that the crisis and the decision occur. By their way of reacting, the deeper meta-biological powers of the race then show whether they have remained stronger than the contingencies and the destinies of the given period of history. In the case of a positive reaction, new potentialities come from deep inside to again saturate the racial circuit. A new ascending cycle begins for that race. In some cases, it is even possible that precision cross-breeding, naturally kept within very stringent limits, carries out a function of that kind. This is well known in zootechnics. The pure breed in some animal species is both the result of the preservation of heredity and of judicious cross-breeding. We do not share the opinion of Chamberlain. Editor's note here. Houston Stewart Chamberlain, who lived from 1855 to 1927, was one of the most influential racial theorists of the early 20th century. His most important work was The Foundations of the 19th Century, published New York by John Lane, 1910. So picking up from the top of that sentence now. We do not share the opinion of Chamberlain, who was inclined to apply this kind of thinking to the superior races of humanity. However, it is a well-known, proven fact that in some aristocratic families which, with their centuries-old blood law, have been the only experimental field for racism in history thus far, Some crossbreedings have had precisely the merit of preventing extinction of the line through inner degeneration. Here, let us stress, the crossbreeding has the function of an ordeal, not a rule. An ordeal, moreover, which can also present a dangerous challenge for the blood. But danger reawakens the spirit. Before the heterogeneous element introduced by crossbreeding, the homogeneous nucleus is called to reaffirm itself, to assimilate to himself what is alien, to act towards it in the capacity of the dominant towards the recessive, in terms of the laws of Mendel. All right, here. Another editor's note. Gregor Johann Mendel, who lived from 1822 to 1884, was a Czech-German scientist and is often called the father of modern genetics. Mendel's laws of inheritance, based on his study of plants across several generations, attempted to define how specific characteristics are transmitted from parents to their offspring. Continuing now. If the reaction is positive, the result is an awakening. The stock which seemed spent and exhausted reawakens. But if it has already fallen too much, or if the heterogeneity is excessive, the ordeal fails and the decline is quick and definitive thereafter. But the highest instrument of the inner awakening of race is combat, and war is its highest expression. That pacifism and humanitarianism are phenomena closely linked to internationalism, democracy, cosmopolitanism, and liberalism is perfectly logical. The same anti-racial instinct presents itself in some is reflected and confirmed in the others. The will towards sub-racial leveling inborn in internationalism finds its ally in pacifist humanitarianism, which has the function of preventing the heroic test from disrupting the game by galvanizing the surviving forces of any remaining not completely deracinated peoples. It is odd, however, and illustrates the error to which a unilaterally biological formulation of the racial problem can lead, that the racial theory of misselections, quote-unquote, as expressed, for example, by Vacher de la Puge, partakes to a certain as expressed, for example, by Vacher de la Puge, partakes to a certain extent of the same incomprehension of the positive meaning of war for race. And we have here yet another editor's note. Georges Vacher de la Puge, who lived from 1854 to 1936, was a French anthropologist, socialist, and racial theorist. He was the author of L'Aryen, Son rôle social, in brackets, the Aryan and his social role, published in Paris in 1899 and never translated into English, at least not prior to the time of this publication. In this work, he classified the various races and proposed that the European Aryans are in opposition to the Jews as racial archetypes. His ideas were highly influential upon the racialist and eugenics movements. Duly noted. From the top of that previous sentence now. Let's see here. It is odd, however, and illustrates the errors to which a unilaterally biological formulation of the racial problem can lead, that the racial theory of misselections, as expressed, for example, by Vacher de la Puge, partakes, to a certain extent, of the same incomprehension of the positive meaning of war for race. But here, in the face of full knowledge of the facts, as is found in internationalist democratism, that doesn't sound like a proper sentence, but whatever. But here, in the face of full knowledge of the facts, as is found in internationalist democratism. Okay, they have a period there that's probably a typo. They should have a semicolon or whatever. To be specific, they suppose that every war turns into a progressive elimination of the best, of the exponents of the still pure race of the various peoples, thus facilitating an involution. This is a partial view, because it only considers what is lost through the disappearance of some individuals, not what is aroused to a much greater extent in others by the experience of war, which otherwise would never have been aroused. This becomes even more obvious if we do not consider ancient wars which were largely fought by elites while the lower strata were spared by them, but rather modern wars which engage entire armed nations and which, moreover, in their character of totality, involve not only physical but also moral and spiritual forces of combatants and non-combatants alike. The Jew Ludwig, editor's note here, Emil Ludwig, who lived from 1881 to 1948, was primarily known at the time as the author of a number of popular biographies of historical figures, including Goethe, Bismarck, and Mussolini. Interesting. The Jew Ludwig expressed fury about an article published in a German military review which brought out the possibilities of selection related to air bombardments, in which the test of sang-froid, the immediate lucrid reaction of the instinction of direction in opposition to brutal or confused impulse, cannot but result in a decisive discrimination of those who have the greatest probability of escaping and surviving from those who do not. The indignation of the humanitarian Jew Ludwig, who has become the bellicose propagator of the so-called New Holy Alliance against fascism, is powerless against what is truthful in considerations of this sort. If the next world war is a total war, it will also mean a total test of the surviving racial forces of the modern world. Without doubt, some will collapse, whereas others will Without doubt, some shall collapse, whereas others will awake and rise. Nameless catastrophes could even be the hard but necessary price of heroic peaks and new liberations of primordial forces dulled through gray centuries of inaction. But such is the fatal condition for the creation of any new world, and it is a new world that we seek for the future, make no mistake. What we have said here must be considered as a mere introduction to the question of significance which war has, in general, for race. 3 fundamental points should be considered in conclusion. First, since we proceed from the assumption that there is a fundamental difference between human races, a difference which, according to the doctrine of the 3 degrees of racism, editor's note here, for more on Evola's theory of race, see Julius Evola, Concept of Race, A Racism of 3 Degrees by Michael Bell at Countercurrents. And we have here a URL link to what I presume to be the ebook edition of that, www.counter-currents.com/2011/Julius-Evola's with an S, so Evola S, -concept-of-race/period. Available as of 26th of April 2011. Interesting. And that notation has doubtless been inserted by the more recent publisher, given that they cited their own edition in that. Evidently not original to the work to begin with. Let's take it from the top of that previous paragraph there. What we have said here must be considered as a mere introduction to the question of the significance which war has, in general, for race. 3 fundamental points should be considered in conclusion. First, since we proceed from the assumption that there is a fundamental difference between human races, a difference which, according to the doctrine of the 3 degrees of racism, is not restricted to corporeality, but concerns also soul and spirit. It should be expected that the spiritual and physical behavior towards the experiences or test of war varies between the various races. It will therefore be both necessary and interesting to define the sense according to which, for each specific race, the aforementioned reaction will occur. Second, it is necessary to consider the interdependent relationship between what a well-understood racial policy can do to promote the aims of war and, conversely, what war, in the presupposition of a correct spiritual attitude, can do to promote the aims of the race. We can speak, in this respect, of a sort of germ, or primary nucleus, created initially or reawakened by racial policy, which brings out racial values in the consciousness of a people, a germ or nucleus which will bear fruit by giving the war a value, while conversely the experience of war and the instincts and currents of deep forces which emerge through such an experience give the racial sense a correct, fecund direction. And this leads us to the third and last point. People are accustomed to speaking too generally and too romantically about heroism, heroic experience, and the like. When they are done with such romantic assumptions in modern times, there seem to remain only material ones, such that men who rise up and fight are considered simply as human material, or perhaps we would say, in the modern day, human capital. And the heroism of the combatants is related to victory as merely a means to an end, the end itself being nothing but the increase of the material and economic power and territory of a given state. In view of the considerations which have been pointed out here, it is necessary to change these attitudes from the ordeal by fire, quote-unquote, of the primordial forces of race and heroic experience above all other experience has been a means to an essentially spiritual and interior end. But there is more. Heroic experience differentiates itself in its results not only according to the various races, but also according to the extent to which, within each race, a super race has formed itself and come to power. He may perhaps be mistranslating Übermensch there, from the sounds of it. The various degrees of this creative differentiation correspond to so many ways of being a hero, and to so many forms of awakening through heroic experience. On the lowest plane, hybrid, essentially vital, instinctive and collective forces emerge. This is somewhat similar to the awakening on a large scale of the primordial horde by the solidarity, unity of destiny, and holocaust which is peculiar to it. Interesting turn of phrase there. Gradually, this mostly naturalistic experience is purified, dignified, and becomes luminous until it reaches its highest form, which corresponds to the Aryan conception of war as holy war, and of victory and triumph as an apex, since its value is identical to the values of holiness and initiation, and finally, of death on the battlefield as mors triumphalis, as not a rhetorical but an effective overcoming of death. Having indicated all of these points in a basic but, we trust, sufficiently intelligible manner, we propose to tackle them one by one in writings which will follow the present one, each of which will specifically consider the varieties of heroic experience according to race, and then the division of war peculiar to the Nordic Aryan and Aryo-Roman tradition in particular. All right then, this concludes Chapter 7 of the Metaphysics of War by Julius Evola. Chapter 8, Two Heroisms, will be next. I must say, that entire chapter is rather antithetical to the modern way of thinking, but then again, that is a large chunk of what Evola's philosophy seems to state. Sort of a traditionalist mindset of one form or another. though I don't think he really considered fascism to be strictly traditional either. As I understand it, he viewed it as a path to traditionalism that was preferable to what they had prior, but he didn't view it as an end in itself, more a means to an end. In any case, I'm going to end this off here, and as to the timing of when the next chapter will be published, maybe in about a week or two. It is presently Monday, December 17th, 2018 at 1:55 a.m. I bid you all adieu. Auf Wiedersehen and good night.